An abandoned ship ignored by everyone, but a human mechanic transforms it into the greatest. Growing up in the small coastal town of Maravista, he spent most of his childhood wandering along the harbor, watching the boats sway gently with the tides, and imagining stories for each vessel. Some were small fishing boats, worn and patched, yet alive with activity. Others were sleek yachts, their polished decks gleaming under the sun. But one ship, more than any other, had captured his curiosity, a massive, rust-covered vessel moored at the far end of the harbor. The ship had been there for as long as anyone could remember. Once a proud cargo ship, it had carried goods between ports, transporting food, machines, and materials across the world. But a terrible storm years ago had damaged it badly, and no one had dared repair it since. Its sails were tattered, the metal hull covered in rust, and weeds had begun to grow along its lower edges. Most of the townspeople avoided it, whispering that it was unlucky or cursed. Children ran past it during their games, afraid of its eerie silence, while fishermen told stories of strange noises echoing from its decks at night. But to Elias, the ship was not frightening. It was a puzzle, a challenge waiting for someone who cared enough to try. Elias worked as a mechanic in a small garage near the harbor. His life was simple, quiet, and often lonely. Most days were spent repairing engines, fixing small boats, and helping locals with broken appliances. He was skilled with his hands and had a natural curiosity for how things worked. He loved to take broken machines apart and put them back together, often improving them along the way. Despite his talent, Elias lived modestly. Money was always tight, and his work never made him rich, but it gave him a sense of purpose. The old ship, though far beyond anything he had repaired before, called to him in a way he could not ignore. One morning, after a long night of repairing a motor for a fisherman, Elias walked along the docks to clear his mind. The sun was just rising, painting the water with golden light. He stopped in front of the abandoned ship and ran his fingers along its corroded railing. He could see the layers of neglect, the peeling paint, the cracks in the wood, the metal eaten away by salt and time. Yet instead of despair, he felt a spark of excitement. To him, this ship was not a lost cause. It was a canvas waiting to be transformed. Elias began to plan. He knew the work would be enormous. The hull was weak in places, the engines had long stopped working, and the interior was filled with debris and broken machinery. He had no team to help him, no funds to hire workers, and only the tools he could carry. Most people in the town would have given up at the thought of taking on such a project. But Elias had never been discouraged by obstacles. He believed that with patience, hard work, and careful observation, even the most broken things could be restored. He spent days simply exploring the ship. He climbed up the rusted ladders, peered into engine rooms, and carefully stepped across slippery decks. He took notes, sketching diagrams of the damaged areas and imagining the repairs that would be needed. Every corner of the ship told a story. The deep scratches on the hull hinted at past storms. The faded name on the stern whispered of long-forgotten journeys, and the empty cabins echoed with memories of sailors who had once called this ship home. Elias felt a strange connection to it, as if the ship itself had chosen him to give it a second chance. Neighbors and friends noticed Elias spending hours on the abandoned vessel. At first, they laughed. "Why are you wasting your time on that old rust heap?" they asked. Some teased him, suggesting he would hurt himself or damage the ship further. Others shook their heads, muttering that he was dreaming too big, that no one could restore a ship in that condition. But Elias did not care. He had never been one to follow the opinions of others. In fact, their doubt made him more determined. He wanted to prove, not just to them but to himself, that something ignored and forgotten could be brought back to life with effort, skill, and heart. Elias began gathering materials. He scoured the harbor for scrap metal, broken tools, and discarded machinery. He bartered with fishermen and traders, exchanging minor repairs or services for old parts. Sometimes he worked through the night, welding broken pieces, sanding rusted panels, and testing engines that had not run in years. Each small success filled him with hope. When a motor roared back to life under his careful hands, or a patch of the hull held firm after hours of labor, he felt the thrill of creation. The ship was slowly responding to his efforts, as if it recognized that someone finally cared for it. The work was exhausting. Elias' hands were often blistered, his clothes covered in oil and rust, and his body aching from long hours on unstable decks. Storms threatened to undo his progress, and sometimes he had to retreat from the ship during harsh winds and heavy rain. Yet every time he returned, he saw small improvements. The ship was changing, piece by piece, from a forgotten relic into something alive. The sense of progress fueled his determination, and he became almost obsessed with the idea of completing the restoration. As days turned into weeks, the ship began to show signs of life. Elias patched holes in the hull, reinforced the wooden floors, and cleaned out debris from the engine room. He carefully restored the cabins, fixing broken doors and making the spaces safe to walk through. Each repair was meticulous. He tested the ship's systems repeatedly, ensuring that every bolt, wire, and piece of machinery worked properly. The transformation was slow, but the results were undeniable. The ship was no longer just a rotting mass of metal. It was a vessel with potential, ready to sail again under the hands of someone who believed in it. Elias also found unexpected joy in the solitude of his work. While most people ignored the ship, he spent hours alone on the decks, talking to himself, humming old sea shanties, and imagining the ship moving through open waters. He pictured the sun reflecting off its polished surfaces, the waves crashing against its hull, and the wind filling its sails. In these quiet moments, the ship became more than a project. It became a companion. Every scrape of metal, every creak of wood, and every turn of a wheel felt like a conversation between him and the vessel. Occasionally, townspeople would watch from afar, curious despite their skepticism. Children peered through gaps in the fencing, whispering excitedly about the strange man working on the giant ship. A few fishermen approached to offer advice or old parts they had lying around. Elias welcomed the help when it came, but he preferred to work alone. This was his mission, his proof that dedication and skill could turn something abandoned into something magnificent. One evening, after weeks of hard work, Elias climbed to the top deck to watch the sunset. The sky was painted in shades of orange and pink, the water reflecting the colors in ripples that danced across the harbor. He ran his hands along the freshly polished railing and looked out over the ship he had begun to restore. Though much work remained, a sense of pride filled him. He could almost hear the ship whispering thanks as if it knew that it had finally been noticed, finally loved. In that moment, Elias realized something important. This project was not just about fixing a ship. It was about hope, persistence, and seeing value where others saw nothing. It was about the quiet triumph of human effort, the kind that does not seek recognition or reward, but finds satisfaction in the act itself. The ship had been abandoned by everyone, ignored and forgotten, but it had not lost its worth. Elias had found it, and in finding it, he had given himself a purpose that went beyond the ordinary days of his life. As night fell and the harbor grew quiet, Elias made a silent promise to the ship. No matter how difficult the work, no matter how many storms or setbacks came, he would see this restoration through. He would not let the ship remain abandoned. He would give it back the life it once had, and in doing so, he would prove that nothing truly loses value when someone believes in it enough to care. The first part of Elias' journey ends not with completion, but with possibility. The ship still waits, half hidden in the shadow of rust and time, but it is no longer just a relic. It is a challenge, a dream, and a chance for transformation. And Elias, the quiet mechanic who dared to see potential where others saw decay, is ready to take the next step, to turn imagination into reality, and to show the world that even the forgotten can become extraordinary when touched by determination, skill, and heart. Elias woke. Early the next morning, the salty breeze from the sea brushing against his face as he stepped onto the deck of the abandoned ship. The sun had barely risen, casting a golden glow across the water and reflecting faintly on the corroded metal of the hull. Despite the ship's worn appearance, Elias felt a surge of energy. Today, he decided, would be a day for real progress. He had already patched small holes in the hull, reinforced weak spots in the deck, and cleaned some of the engine room. But the hardest work was still ahead. The first challenge of the day was the main engine. It had not worked in years, and Elias knew he would have to study it carefully before attempting repairs. He descended into the engine room, the smell of rust and old oil filling his senses. Every pipe, bolt, and gear was coated with grime, and some parts were damaged beyond recognition. Elias knelt on the cold metal floor, tools in hand, and began his careful inspection. He worked slowly, taking his time to understand how everything connected. Each piece he removed, cleaned, or replaced brought him closer to breathing life back into the ship. Hours passed with little visible progress. Elias tested wires, adjusted valves, and cleaned corroded connections. He sometimes paused, leaning against the wall, wiping sweat from his forehead, and staring at the dim light filtering through rusted windows. The work was exhausting, both physically and mentally. There were moments when he doubted himself, wondering if the engine was too far gone, or if he had taken on more than he could handle. But Elias had learned early in life that persistence often yielded results when talent alone could not. With determination, he pressed on, treating each small success as a victory. As the day went on, he took breaks on the upper deck, looking out at the calm sea. The harbor was alive with activity. Fishermen mending nets, cargo being loaded onto smaller ships, and children running along the pier. Occasionally, someone would glance at Elias and the ship with curiosity, but most continued with their day, ignoring the massive vessel at the far end of the harbor. He did not mind their lack of attention. In fact, it allowed him to work without distraction. The ship was his world now, a space where effort and imagination mattered more than opinions. By mid-afternoon, he had managed to repair part of the engine. Turning the ignition key, he listened as the familiar mechanical hum began to vibrate through the hull. It was faint at first, like a whisper, but it grew stronger as he adjusted valves and connected missing wires. Elias' heart raced with excitement. For the first time in years, the ship was responding to human hands. He smiled, his face dirty and streaked with oil, feeling a connection with the machine that went beyond work. It felt alive. The excitement did not last long. A sudden clatter echoed from the upper deck as a loose metal panel fell from the ship's mast. Elias hurried up the ladder, nearly slipping on wet spots, and secured the panel with heavy-duty clamps. The incident reminded him that the ship was fragile. One mistake could undo hours of progress or even cause injury. He realized he needed to move cautiously, balancing speed with safety. It was a delicate dance, repairing something old and delicate while also trying to make significant improvements. Elias spent the next few weeks in a rhythm of work, rest, and study. Each day brought new challenges. Some days weather interfered, strong winds, heavy rains, and saltwater spray made working on the deck dangerous. Other days, parts he needed were unavailable, forcing him to improvise using whatever scraps and tools he could find. Sometimes a patch of the hull would collapse under his hands, or an old valve would crack just as he had fixed it. These setbacks were discouraging, but Elias had learned to see them as lessons rather than failures. Each obstacle taught him patience, creativity, and resilience. During this time, he also began restoring the interiors. The cabins were filled with broken furniture, torn curtains, and layers of dust. He worked carefully, cleaning each room, repairing floors, and making sure every surface was stable. It was slow, painstaking work, but he found joy in it. Every repaired window, every polished floorboard, and every fixed door was proof that the ship could be more than an abandoned relic. It could become a home, a safe space, a vessel ready for adventure. Elias' work did not go unnoticed forever. Some townspeople, initially skeptical, began to approach him, offering tools, old parts, or advice. A retired fisherman showed him how to reinforce the hull using techniques from his youth. A local carpenter donated wood and nails for the cabins. While Elias appreciated the help, he remained cautious. He wanted the ship to be his creation, the result of his vision and labor. He listened politely, incorporated useful suggestions, and continued to lead the work. Despite occasional help, most of the work remained solitary. Elias often found himself thinking about the ship late at night, planning the next steps, and imagining how each repair would affect the overall structure. He studied old manuals, sketched diagrams, and experimented with solutions that combined traditional methods with his own creative ideas. Some were successful, others failed, leaving him frustrated but wiser. The process was long, and sometimes progress seemed almost invisible, but Elias understood that transformation was a slow journey. As weeks turned into months, he began to notice real change. The hull, once riddled with holes, was reinforced and watertight. The engines, now repaired in stages, ran smoothly for longer periods. The decks were safer to walk on, and the cabins became clean and functional. Each milestone brought a sense of accomplishment that Elias had rarely experienced before. The ship, once forgotten and abandoned, was slowly regaining its dignity. During this period, Elias also learned to appreciate the small victories. A newly installed railing that stayed firm during high winds, a cabin floor that no longer creaked, or an engine that held steady for several hours. All these details, seemingly minor, were evidence that his efforts were paying off. They reminded him that transformation is rarely sudden. It is the accumulation of careful, consistent work. The ship was teaching him lessons in patience, precision, and care. Elias faced moments of doubt, too. There were days when he felt exhausted, frustrated, or overwhelmed by the sheer scale of the work. The ship seemed endless in its needs, each repair revealing new problems. Sometimes the monotony of labor weighed heavily on him, and he questioned whether the effort was worth it. But in those moments, he remembered why he had started. He remembered the vision he had first seen, the possibility that the abandoned ship could be restored, that something ignored by everyone could become extraordinary. This memory rekindled his determination and carried him through the toughest days. One evening, after a long day of work, Elias stood on the top deck, watching the harbor lights twinkle like tiny stars on the water. The ship no longer looked like a broken relic. It had structure, stability, and a sense of purpose. Though far from complete, it was beginning to reflect the care and dedication he had poured into it. He imagined it sailing under the open sky, the engines humming steadily, and the wind filling its sails. The thought brought a smile to his face. For the first time, he felt that his dream was not impossible. The ship became a part of his life in every way. Elias slept on the deck during nights of calm weather, waking early to continue repairs. He shared meals with the gulls that perched nearby, spoke to himself to organize his thoughts, and celebrated even the smallest successes. The labor was hard, sometimes lonely, but deeply satisfying. Every hour spent on the ship was a step toward a goal that mattered not because others cared, but because he did. By the end of the second part of his journey, the ship had begun to take on the first hints of transformation. It was still a work in progress, still rusted in places and imperfect in others, but Elias could see the life returning to it. The harbor that once ignored the vessel now occasionally paused to watch his efforts. Some townspeople were curious, others respectful, and a few began to feel inspired by the sight of a man dedicating himself to restoring something that seemed lost. Elias, however, remained focused. The work was far from finished, and he knew that the greatest challenges still lay ahead. As the sun set over the water, casting long shadows across the deck, Elias stood near the bow, looking out at the horizon. He could feel the weight of the work yet to be done, the months of labor stretching before him. But he also felt a quiet confidence, the satisfaction of knowing that the ship was responding to care, skill, and dedication. Each repair, each adjustment, each small victory was proof that transformation was possible. The ship, abandoned and ignored by everyone, was slowly coming back to life. And so was Elias, learning patience, determination, and the power of belief in something others had forgotten. The second part of Elias' journey ends with a sense of struggle and triumph. The ship remains a challenge, but it is no longer hopeless. Elias' labor, creativity, and perseverance have begun to change not just the vessel but himself. The road ahead is long, full of obstacles, but he is ready to face them. For Elias, the abandoned ship is no longer just a forgotten object. It is a living testament to the power of human effort, the thrill of creation, and the hope that even the most ignored things can rise again when someone dares to care. Elias had spent months working on the ship, slowly transforming it from a forgotten, rusted hull into a vessel that showed signs of life and purpose. The change was no longer only visible to him. Others in the harbor had begun to notice. Small groups of townspeople paused near the fence, whispering in astonishment at the progress he had made. Some of the older fishermen shook their heads, saying that no one could have imagined a ship like this could ever sail again. Elias, however, continued his work with quiet focus, letting the results speak for themselves. One morning, as the sun rose over the harbor, Elias climbed to the top deck to survey the ship. He traced his fingers along the freshly polished railing, the metal cool under his touch. The hull, once riddled with holes and rust, had been reinforced with strong steel plates he had salvaged and carefully fitted. The engines, repaired and tested repeatedly, were now capable of running for extended periods. Each deck had been stabilized, and the cabins were beginning to resemble living spaces instead of abandoned rooms filled with debris. For the first time, Elias felt that the ship could truly be called seaworthy, even if it still needed finishing touches. The growing attention from the townspeople brought a mixture of pride and unease. Some were genuinely curious, asking questions about his methods and occasionally offering assistance. A retired shipwright named Marco had approached him with a box of old tools and spare parts. "I've never seen anyone so committed to a vessel like this," Marco said, his voice full of admiration. Elias accepted the help graciously but remained careful to maintain control over the project. This ship was his vision, and he wanted every repair, every improvement to reflect his work and ideas. As the days passed, the ship's transformation became more remarkable. Elias had installed improved safety features, reinforcing the decks and adding railings to prevent accidents. He had cleaned and repaired all cabins, fixing broken doors, restoring floors, and even installing small storage compartments to organize supplies. The once dark and foreboding interior now had light and space, giving the ship an inviting atmosphere. Even the engine room, a place of noise and grease, was organized and functional, a testament to Elias' skill and careful planning. But the work was far from over. Despite the visible improvements, Elias faced persistent challenges. Some areas of the hull still showed signs of corrosion that needed constant attention. The engines, though repaired, required fine-tuning to ensure they could withstand long voyages. Electrical systems were outdated and fragile, requiring meticulous rewiring. Every day brought new problems, and Elias approached each one with a mix of patience and determination. He knew that rushing or cutting corners could undo all his progress. One afternoon, a sudden storm rolled in from the sea. Dark clouds covered the sky, and strong winds whipped the ship from side to side. Elias hurried to secure loose panels and tighten the remaining fixtures, his hands raw and aching from weeks of labor. Rain pounded the deck, making the surface slippery and treacherous. For hours, he worked against the storm, refusing to leave the ship until he was certain it could withstand the weather. When the storm finally passed, the ship had survived intact. Elias stood on the deck, soaked to the bone, exhausted but proud. The storm had tested both the vessel and his work, and they had endured. Word of Elias' ship spread beyond the harbor. A journalist from a nearby town came to see the vessel, intrigued by stories of a mechanic reviving a long-forgotten ship. She asked questions, took photographs, and watched Elias carefully explain each repair and improvement. Her excitement was genuine, and she promised to write an article highlighting his efforts. The attention surprised Elias, but he did not seek fame. He simply wanted the ship to succeed, to show that careful work and dedication could bring life back to something abandoned. As more people learned of the project, a few volunteers began to offer assistance. Local carpenters helped replace broken wooden beams, fishermen shared techniques for reinforcing decks, and some donated old supplies that Elias could repurpose. Though the work had become more collaborative, Elias still led the effort, ensuring that every repair met his standards. He appreciated the support, but he also knew that the ship's true character had to come from his own vision and labor. The transformation was not only physical but symbolic. The ship, once ignored and ridiculed, had become a symbol of perseverance and hope. Townspeople who had once dismissed the project now paused to watch, inspired by Elias' determination. Children came to peek at the ship, asking questions about engines, woodwork, and metalwork. Some even offered to help in small ways, sweeping decks or fetching tools. Elias welcomed their curiosity, seeing it as an opportunity to teach and inspire. One day, while working on the upper deck, Elias noticed that the ship had begun to attract the attention of sailors from nearby ports. They were curious about the vessel and the man restoring it. A group of experienced sailors offered advice on navigation and rigging, and Elias listened carefully, taking notes and learning from their experience. Though he had studied and planned meticulously, he realized that there was always room to improve, to learn, and to make the ship even stronger. The ship's interiors also reflected Elias' creativity. He had converted unused storage areas into functional compartments, making space for supplies, tools, and personal belongings. Cabins were brightened with fresh paint, and simple, sturdy furniture he had restored himself. Even the common areas were organized, clean, and practical, showing that a vessel could be both functional and welcoming. Each improvement was a reflection of Elias' dedication, imagination, and careful planning. By the middle of Part 3, the ship had become nearly unrecognizable from its former state. The once-forgotten hull now gleamed under the sun in patches where Elias had polished metal, and the decks were firm and secure. The engines hummed steadily, ready to power the vessel through calm seas and rough waters alike. The cabins were tidy, the safety features robust, and the overall structure sound. Yet Elias knew that one mistake could undo months of work. He continued to inspect, repair, and test, never taking shortcuts or allowing carelessness. The growing attention from the community brought both pride and responsibility. People began asking if they could take small trips on the ship or help transport goods. Some asked to be part of its future, hoping to share in the success of a vessel once abandoned. Elias considered each request carefully, deciding to involve others only in ways that would benefit the ship without compromising its integrity. He wanted the vessel to remain a symbol of dedication and craftsmanship, not just a public attraction. One evening, Elias stood on the bow as the sun dipped below the horizon. The sky was painted in deep shades of orange, pink, and purple, reflecting on the water's surface. He looked over the ship, noticing every repair, every reinforced panel, and every polished surface. The ship had survived storms, neglect, and doubt, and now it was ready to take on the world again. Elias felt a profound sense of accomplishment. It was not just the work of his hands that mattered, but the vision he had held onto for months, believing that something abandoned could be restored with patience, skill, and care. He also reflected on the personal growth the project had brought him. Working alone for long hours had taught him resilience, problem-solving, and the importance of perseverance. Collaborating with others had reminded him of the value of community, shared knowledge, and mutual respect. He had discovered that transformation was not only about fixing something physical, but also about learning, growing, and inspiring others along the way. Soon, the ship was ready for its first test. Elias invited a small group of trusted helpers, people who had contributed to the restoration in meaningful ways, to join him. The engines roared to life, steady and strong, vibrating through the hull. The ship moved slowly at first, gliding through the calm waters of the harbor. Everyone watched in awe, realizing that the vessel, once forgotten and ignored, had come back to life. Elias smiled quietly, feeling a deep connection to the ship that had been his companion, his challenge, and his teacher. The success of the initial trial brought renewed energy. Elias knew that further adjustments and refinements were necessary, but the sight of the ship moving confidently through the water reinforced his belief in the project. It was proof that careful work, perseverance, and unwavering dedication could overcome even the greatest obstacles. The ship had not only survived, but had begun to thrive under his guidance. From that point on, the ship became a source of inspiration for the community. People who had doubted Elias now admired him, recognizing the effort, skill, and creativity that had gone into restoring a vessel that seemed beyond hope. Local children began to ask questions, eager to learn about mechanics, repair, and engineering. Fishermen consulted him for advice, appreciating his meticulous approach. The ship, once abandoned and ignored, had become a symbol of possibility, demonstrating that with care and determination, even forgotten things could rise again. Elias continued working tirelessly. Each day brought small improvements, fine-tuning engines, securing decks, polishing metal, and reinforcing cabins. He learned from setbacks, adapting to challenges, and finding creative solutions. The ship's transformation was ongoing, but the direction was clear. What had once been an abandoned, forgotten vessel was now a functional, impressive ship that carried the mark of human perseverance. By the end of Part 3, the ship was ready to leave the harbor for longer voyages. It was no longer merely a dream or a project, it had become a reality. Elias had not only restored a vessel, but had proven that dedication, skill, and belief could turn something ignored into something extraordinary. The ship had survived storms, neglect, and doubt, and now it stood ready to face the open sea, a testament to human determination and vision. The morning sunlight reflected on the calm waters of Maravista Harbor, painting golden streaks across the surface. Elias Morno stood on the top deck of the ship he had spent months restoring, feeling the gentle rocking of the vessel beneath his feet. The smell of salt and sea filled his lungs, and the hum of the engines was steady and strong, a sound that now brought him comfort and pride. After months of tireless work, the ship that everyone had once ignored was finally ready for long journeys beyond the harbor. It was no longer a forgotten relic. It had become alive again, a symbol of hope, perseverance, and the power of human dedication. Elias had decided that the first voyage would not be for profit or fame. Instead, he wanted the ship to serve the community that had grown curious and supportive over the past months. He planned to transport essential goods to nearby villages, help fishermen who were struggling, and even offer educational trips for local students who had shown interest in mechanics and engineering. The ship was no longer only a project. It had become a tool to give back, a way to share the lessons Elias had learned and the joy of restoring something abandoned. The day of the first voyage arrived, and a small crowd gathered at the dock. Townspeople had come to watch the ship set sail, some out of curiosity, others out of admiration. Children pressed their faces against the railings, excited to see the vessel move under its own power. Fishermen offered words of encouragement, and a few of Elias' closest helpers, who had assisted in restoring the ship, came to join him for the journey. Elias felt a quiet pride, knowing that what had begun as a solitary mission had grown into something meaningful for many. He checked the engines one final time, carefully inspecting each valve, wire, and lever. The ship had undergone countless tests already, but Elias knew that nothing could replace caution. As the sun rose higher, casting sparkling light across the water, he gave the signal to release the mooring lines. The ship moved slowly at first, then gained momentum, cutting through the calm waters of the harbor with confidence. The crowd cheered, and Elias allowed himself a brief smile, acknowledging the realization of months of work, effort, and belief. As the ship glided toward open waters, Elias reflected on the journey that had brought them here. Every patch of rust he had removed, every engine part he had repaired, and every hour spent sanding, welding, and polishing had led to this moment. The work had been exhausting, lonely at times, and filled with obstacles that could have stopped him. Yet he had persisted. And now the ship that everyone had ignored was sailing, not just as a restored vessel, but as a testament to what dedication and vision could achieve. During the voyage, Elias navigated carefully, testing the ship's handling and observing how the engines responded to longer stretches of travel. The vessel moved steadily, its reinforced hull cutting through the waves with stability. He made small adjustments, fine-tuning controls and checking the safety systems he had installed. Everything worked as he had hoped, and the sense of accomplishment filled him with a quiet joy that was more profound than any praise he could receive. The ship had survived storms, neglect, and doubt, and now it was fully capable of fulfilling its purpose. The journey also gave Elias time to think about the people who had inspired him along the way. The retired shipwright, the local carpenters, the fishermen who shared knowledge, and even the children who had watched curiously. They had all played a part in the ship's revival, even if their contributions were small. Elias realized that restoration was not only about machinery and metal. It was also about community, learning from others, and sharing knowledge. The ship had become a bridge, connecting him to people who cared about the sea, about craftsmanship, and about hope. As the ship approached a nearby village, Elias carefully maneuvered it to the dock. Villagers, who had heard about the restored vessel, gathered to watch in amazement. The ship that had once been a source of fear and superstition was now a marvel to behold. Elias and his helpers began unloading supplies, food, medicine, and tools, carefully placing them on the dock for distribution. The villagers expressed their gratitude with smiles, words of thanks, and gestures of admiration. For Elias, these moments were more rewarding than any recognition or reward. They were proof that his efforts had meaning beyond personal satisfaction. The ship also became an opportunity to teach. Elias invited children to explore the cabins, showing them how the engines worked and explaining the repairs he had made. He spoke about the importance of patience, observation, and creativity. The children listened with wide eyes, fascinated by the idea that a neglected vessel could be transformed through care and hard work. For Elias, this was one of the greatest rewards of all, the chance to inspire the next generation, to show them that dedication and belief could turn something forgotten into something extraordinary. Over the following weeks, the ship continued to serve the community. It transported supplies to isolated villages, helped stranded fishermen, and even carried passengers on short educational trips. Each journey brought new lessons and challenges, and Elias welcomed them. He learned how the ship responded in different weather conditions, how to improve efficiency, and how to make life aboard more comfortable and safe. The vessel was no longer just a project. It had become a living, functioning part of the coastal community. As the ship gained recognition, the local media began to cover Elias' story. Newspapers and television crews came to the harbor to document the restoration, eager to share the tale of the mechanic who had transformed an abandoned ship into a symbol of hope. The attention surprised Elias, but he did not seek fame. For him, the ship's greatest achievement was not public recognition, but the lives it touched and the inspiration it provided. The story of the ship became a source of pride for the entire town, a reminder that perseverance and belief could overcome neglect and doubt. Elias also reflected on how the journey had changed him personally. He had grown stronger, more patient, and more confident in his abilities. The months of labor had taught him to think creatively, to adapt to challenges, and to value the process of careful, thoughtful work. He had learned that setbacks were not failures, but opportunities to learn and improve. Most importantly, he had discovered the joy of creating something that could outlast himself, a vessel that would sail long after his efforts had ended, carrying with it the story of persistence and care. One evening, as the sun set over the horizon, Elias stood at the bow, feeling the gentle sway of the ship beneath him. The water shimmered with the colors of the sky, and the air was filled with the soft sounds of waves lapping against the hull. He thought back to the first day he had stepped onto the rusted, abandoned ship. It had seemed impossible then, a task too large and daunting for a single man. Yet here he was, watching a vessel he had restored glide confidently through the sea. The sense of accomplishment was overwhelming, but it was tempered by humility. The ship had required patience, learning, and the contributions of others, and it had rewarded him with something far greater than recognition: purpose. The ship's journey also became a source of community pride. Townspeople began to see the harbor differently, noticing the beauty and potential in things that others might overlook. Children learned the value of care, attention, and persistence. Adults were reminded that even long-forgotten projects or neglected opportunities could become meaningful when approached with effort and dedication. The ship was no longer just a vessel. It had become a symbol, a living reminder that determination and belief could transform the ordinary into the extraordinary. Elias continued to expand the ship's role. He organized training sessions for aspiring mechanics, showing them how to repair engines, reinforce hulls, and maintain safety systems. He also worked with local fishermen, teaching techniques to improve their vessels and ensure safe navigation. The ship became a center for learning, a place where knowledge was shared freely and creativity encouraged. It was a living classroom, combining the lessons of the sea, mechanics, and human effort. As months passed, the ship's reputation grew. Sailors from nearby towns came to see it, eager to learn from Elias and witness the remarkable transformation firsthand. Some offered advice, tools, or assistance, while others simply marveled at the skill and dedication that had brought the vessel back to life. Elias welcomed the exchange, recognizing that the restoration was never only about him. It was about collaboration, learning, and building something that could endure. Through it all, Elias remained humble. He never sought fame or reward, focusing instead on the satisfaction of seeing the ship thrive. Every voyage, every repair, and every moment of shared knowledge reminded him of the value of persistence, patience, and belief in the face of doubt. The ship had started as a rusted, abandoned relic, ignored by everyone, and it had become a living testament to human ingenuity, effort, and heart. In the end, the ship's greatest achievement was not the voyages it completed or the goods it transported, but the inspiration it provided. It showed that even when something is ignored, overlooked, or deemed worthless, care, determination, and vision can bring it back to life. Elias had transformed not only the ship, but the way people saw potential in forgotten things. The vessel had become a symbol of hope, a story to be shared, and a reminder that the extraordinary often begins with a single person who refuses to give up. As Elias looked out at the horizon one last time, the sun dipping into the sea, he felt a sense of peace. The ship would sail for years, carrying with it the story of perseverance, skill, and quiet dedication. Children would continue to learn from it. Townspeople would remember its journey, and travelers from distant ports would marvel at what one person's effort could achieve. The abandoned ship, once ignored by everyone, had become the greatest vessel of all, not because of its size or speed, but because of the care, vision, and heart that had brought it back to life.